Well, my name is Brian Krebs. I think you guys probably already know that. But if you would, just for the record, just go ahead and state your names and tell me what you do for Coalfire.
Sure. I'm Tom McAndrew, and I'm Coalfire's CEO.
Gary DiMercurio. I'm a managing senior here at Bellevue.
I'm Justin Wynn. I'm a senior security consultant with Coalfire.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for agreeing to talk with me about this whole thing. It's generated a tremendous amount of interest from many people in the security community, as you know, and even from people who don't really know much or care about security have gotten interested in the story. So, I was really interested in having an opportunity to talk with you about this. I want to talk about first what happened, how we got here, but also what we can take away from this incident and what you learned as a result of going through this process, which, incredibly has taken, 4 months now plus to play out. But I want to just recap real quick about what happened. So it was on September 1st of last year. Two of you, I guess you guys are senior penetration testing experts there. You were arrested while performing a previously agreed upon physical and network security pen test at a courthouse in Dallas County, Iowa. Is that right?
The date was September 11th. I believe you said the 1st.
So it was September 11th, right?
Correct.
That's right, yeah.
Excellent. Okay. Now, from what I've gathered, getting questioned or even detained by authorities in the course of doing these penetration tests isn't all that uncommon. But what was remarkable here was that even after the Coalfire was able to convince the deputies who responded to the scene that you guys were there on a legitimate prearranged engagement, the sheriff in charge of that whole scene and the local prosecutors decided to press forward with burglary charges anyway. So I wanted to talk about the night of the incident in a second, but first, please just tell us a little background about this particular client. As I understand it, Coalfire had a long-standing contract to perform physical and network penetration tests on specific public buildings in Dallas County, and this wasn't your first penetration test, was it?
So I think it's important to provide a little bit of background. So it was a red team engagement, and we had multiple attack surfaces that we were covering. So a lot of this is virtual, and then we came on site that week of the 11th to perform the physical penetration test. So as part of that, all the contracts are out there in public. So free to say there were 5 buildings that we were supposed to assess. There was only one in Dallas County. The rest were kind of in Polk County or the judicial buildings, but all government facilities and all courthouses and judicial branch buildings. So we were out there. No, it wasn't the first physical penetration breach that we did during that assessment. I think in the news, and we're trying to stick to what's already been publicly released, is there were multiple facilities that we had already assessed, and this one was kind of the last one that we were coming around to.
Okay. So you mentioned a contract. I apologize, I haven't read it, but what were I will if I can get my hands on it. What specifically were the terms of those engagements? Did they specify that Coalfire would use non-destructive means to test the physical security of various county premises, or what?
Yep. So that's how the contract reads, and it's very important to go over the discussion of the call that we have. So we always have initial scoping calls with the clients just to make sure that we're on the same page, discuss the techniques and tactics to be used, and kind of what the client's looking for out of an assessment like this. So during that engagement, we're covering all the locations that we're supposed to be assessing. It's a red team engagement with physical penetration testing included as part of it. So for those, they specifically requested they wanted after-hours testing at these locations. As part of that, physical bypasses, lock picking, we kind of enumerated all these different tactics that we typically use on engagements, and the client was confirming and acknowledging with us, yep, this is what we want. We want to see how our facilities can be breached and what the security vulnerabilities are that we're working with.
We're a 750 person company, right? So we're not a tiny little company doing this. We worked in all 50 states. We've done over 1,000 of these types of engagements in the past. So that is some background. Is like we do this all the time. And so as we're going through these processes out there, And you can see in the contract, we've got, scope and assumptions and all those sorts of areas. And there's just kind of some very unique circumstances in this particular case, which has made, cause some of the challenges that we've got.
Right. So did this particular contract you have with the county, did it require Coalfire at all to, give county officials any advance notice or some idea of when these tests might be performed? Or is that something you normally do? Or was that even spelled out in the contract you have?
Gary?
It's not something we normally do. Typically, when we're working with the client, the client will let us know if they own the building, if they've got or if we have the ability to test the building. In this instance, during our call, we asked very specific questions about each building individual. We went over, the client would tell us if there was any security controls, if there was armed guards, the things that are very important that we want to know before we test the actual building itself. Whether or not it should be doing before or after hours. We go over ad nauseum on what it is that we're doing in each specific building. So in this case, especially, this was one of those times where we went over each individual thing, each individual point, and at the areas that we weren't supposed to be in, they said, well, we don't own that. We're not allowed to do this. This is an area that you should stay out of, and these are the areas that you can. When you're here after hours, you can do X, Y, or Z. For instance, don't go on this floor, but you can show that you have the ability to get to the floor, open a door, take a picture to show that you can get into this office or whatever it happens to be as an example, but don't go into this office. So all those things were hit. All the things that we were supposed to do and weren't supposed to were gone over, and that's typically where that ends as far as the discussion with the client and scoping on what it is that we're supposed to do while we're on site.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the engagement that brings us here. From what I've read, it sounds like this particular pen test started in the early morning hours of September 11th last year. Justin, you and Gary were attempting to get around the security system at the courthouse in Dallas County, Iowa. Set the scene for us just a little bit and describe what happened that eventually summoned the police, if you will.
Well, we do have to correct you on one bit. We were not trying to get around the security system. The contract specifically stated that we were not to circumvent the alarm system of the courthouse. That's the first misnomer that was out there. The way that it was stated was we were to try to gain entry to the courthouse, and we were not allowed to circumvent the alarm. So that's actually what we were trying to do, or what we were performing at the time. So please take it away.
Right. And in addition to that, the contract also stated no forced entry, which we explained with the client over the phone. That's synonymous with destructive entry. So it's not like we're going to be rolling up to the courthouse and throwing a brick through the window and gaining access that way. So what can you do with bypass techniques or using lockpicking? So we had assessed a couple other locations by that point, and as the media has put out, there was no response. So no alarms had been set off at some of the locations. Nobody had ever showed up. So we come out to this courthouse, and we'd been there during the day to do initial enumeration, and we saw the alarm system in place, and we said, okay, hopefully this will be the place where alarms finally go off. So we come up after hours again, after we observe the alarm, and it looks like it's armed, and we're like, okay, great, we can't bypass that alarm, that's not in scope, but let's see if we can gain access, and then see if anybody actually responds to this location. So as it happened, and again, as kind of media has already put out, I don't want to disclose any vulnerabilities or any technical details on it. But we bypassed the door, gained access. This audible alarms are just blaring all throughout downtown. So we go inside the building and proceed to wait hoping law enforcement would show up to the situation, which of course they did.
And that's kind of standard operating procedure for you if you set the alarms off to wait for them to show up?
Right. It can vary depending on the type of testing that the client wants, but in this case, absolutely had the get out of jail free letter on hand, and we were waiting for the deputies to respond. Once they did, and we saw that they were there, we decided to start making verbal commands. We were inside the courthouse; they were still outside, and letting them know that we were inside the building before eventually coming out, proceeding very slowly, and then working with law enforcement to verify our presence there.
Trying to let them know that we were in there. They couldn't get in to the courthouse, so we were doing everything in our power to let them know that we were working, and that we were supposed to be there. Unfortunately, they weren't able to get in. We ended up having to come out. So we've worked with a lot of law enforcement agencies, and this is not the first time or the last time that we'll ever come in contact with police officers. So through some experience and after the fact and everything is done, we'll typically sit down with law enforcement that shows up and say, hey, is there anything we did wrong? Is there anything we could do better to help prevent some sort of incident? And so the way that we went about this particular scenario is through years of experience with other law enforcement. So we were trying to make it, you don't want them to come find you, number one. That's going to be bad scenario for everybody. So we were actually on the top floor waiting by the stairwell, trying to shout down to the police officers, let us know that we were up there, that we were, under contract, that we were doing a security assessment, but unfortunately they weren't able to get into the building. So we eventually had to come and talk to them.
They weren't able to come. They weren't able to come in the way you had come in, or they weren't able to get into the building, or what was that about?
They weren't able to get in at all. I think they were having a problem with their with the code or the cards, whatever the method is that they're able to get into the building. Whether that was an administrative problem or not, I don't really know, to be honest.
Can you talk about how you got in?
Well, maybe rather than this specific say, I'd say, I mean, we've read the report, right? So if you look at it, every time we do these red team tests, you always find, areas or aha moments or gotcha that people should have fixed. And I think we're waiting on that because we're not sure who knows this and whether those issues have been fixed. Yeah. So we don't want to lower their security saying, hey, we got in this way. It's like a physical 0 day, I guess, right? So we don't want to do it. I would say that it's not some initial media reports made it sound like, we've got James Bond high device tools, and I'd say you would be underwhelmed at the methods that were used to gain access to different sorts of facilities there. And that's not unique, right? I mean, we see this all the time. And part of the reasons why we're brought in to do this is typically you have dilapidated systems and outdated security systems, and physical buildings is not where a lot of states and counties are investing their dollars. Yeah. And so these tests help alert people saying, yes, while you're doing some of the cybersecurity side, if you've got vaults full of data or you've got physical risks, they're just as bad, if not more so. So that was something that we did find here. And I think another thing, Brian, since you're not familiar with the contract, as we go through it, we specifically ask the customer, like, what buildings to test. And so two things were kind of unique in this, right, is that usually when a customer says, here's the buildings and you confirm them, we assume those are the buildings. And if you're doing a test for the state and you walk into a building and it's a courthouse and you're doing work for the court system, you think that they would have jurisdiction or own it. And that turned out not to be the case in this scenario, because there are some things that the state owns and some things that the county owns. And that was something that we weren't aware of as we did some of this work or didn't understand the nuances. And then two, in our statement of work, we specifically have the client make a determination of whether they want to notify law enforcement or not. And so that's something that we specifically bring up, and they specifically said no. And so that's another area that, as we work for the customers, and these are kind of the lessons learned of, how do you validate that the buildings they say you can test, and when they say, we will notify law enforcement, or law enforcement will not be notified, and we'll kind of manage those processes. Do we allow them to do that? And it's different from a state versus a commercial organization, but those are two kind of unique factors in this case. And
make things even more murky or cloudy, if you will, with this scenario, is there was a third-party investigation that was launched by the state, and the lawyer at the time, or I should say at the end of the investigation, his conclusion was the state did have authority. Again, his interpretation of the law, but that interpretation of the law was the state did have authority to allow us to go into that building. So it's all based on legal, or the lack of legal precedent, actually, because it's one of those times that it's something that was very unique that just doesn't happen.
Just to be clear, you were hired by the county or by the state?
The state.
By the state.
Yeah, so if you think about, like, the state, right, owns the contract, and they have courthouses all throughout the state, right? And so as part of this, we go to different courthouses. Some of them they own, like in the Capitol, in these other areas, like in this place, Dallas County, we assume that they had it or they had the right, and that's where there's some ambiguity in the law of, are they, basically renting back those services? Does the state have the authority to launch a physical security test of a county courthouse? That basically was kind of the question that is not well understood now.
Okay, we'll come back to that in a second. But so coming back to the scene, you're there. You trip the alarms. Was this the beginning of that particular pen test at that location, or was it toward the end? Or could you describe, just without getting into details you can't talk about, obviously, some of the things some of the other things you might have done while you're there?
Go for it.
So yeah, we had come on site prior to that location, done our initial assessment during the day while the courthouse is open, to be able to walk through and kind of see what we're dealing with, and kind of get an attack plan for later that night. So after we had arrived that night and set off the alarms, the response from law enforcement was very expeditious. Arrived on scene very quickly, so it was pretty much, we had gained access to the facility, the alarms were already going off. We sat in there and waited for, it must have been between 3 or 5 minutes before law enforcement showed up. After that point, we announced that we were there, slowly came outside the building, asked them, being very slow moving and showing our hands, hey, do you want us to open this door? Since obviously they were having difficulties gaining access. At which point he responded yes. So we exit the facility and then start working with law enforcement to verify our presence. So that includes some things like presenting our get out of jail free letter. The responding officers actually reached out and they contacted our points of contact from the client and verified that we were supposed to be on site there.
And to be clear, and this was like the third day, right? So
Right.
I think that's one thing, right? Is that this is, you guys had gone. You want to talk? You guys had gone to previous locations the other days and reported back.
Yep.
Right.
And so we were kind of midway through the week by the time this incident already happened.
Right. I read somewhere in one of the previous engagements you all left a business card or something. Is a calling card, if you will?
That's exactly right. So yep, left a business card with the point of contact's desk. He emailed us very first thing the next morning and said, I guess I owe you congratulations. And we later found out they had reviewed all the footage. They saw how we gained access, and I think they were pretty thrilled with it. So our response back was, yep, we're finishing up the assessment and can't wait to return back to you with some of these findings so we can help secure these facilities.
Right. So the police arrive. You show them your get out of jail free cards. They make whatever calls they need to do. They seem to be satisfied. What happens next?
So yeah, real quick, discussing that, we do want to take the time to thank the responding officers, all the sheriff's deputies that initially showed up and responded to the incident. Everyone was very professional, handled the situation beautifully, took the time to verify and keep us, I wouldn't say formally detained, but going through the process of verifying us.
Informally detained.
Yes.
Informally.
Informally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Informally.
Okay. And so after that point, they reached out to our point of contact, verified we're supposed to be there. They had taken our driver's licenses and kind of did whatever review that they wanted to do. And then the sergeant in charge at that point actually came back to us, handed us our driver's license back, and said something along the lines of, as far as I'm concerned, you guys should be good to go. So at that point where we were free and clear, and we sat around talking with a lot of the responding officers, and they're asking us questions. We're all joking and having a good time. Like, man, how'd you get this job? What are some of the craziest things that you've seen? How'd you gain access here? And then the sheriff ended up showing up to that incident, and the situation quickly changed.
Yeah.
Right. So at that point, the sheriff, the tone of the conversation changed a little bit, I guess. And Gary and Justin, you were you arrested at that point, or what happened?
We weren't arrested at that point. I think there was some, I guess, a separate investigative process that the sheriff was doing. He threatened to arrest us, said he was going to go talk to somebody, and disappeared. And to be honest, after he left, we just continued talking with the rest of the deputies. And I think there was a single city police officer there. We just went about business as usual. We figured everything was going to be fine. We kept going over techniques and bypass, and I think we actually went into detail about how we got in with the deputies. So hopefully, if it didn't get remedied through the pen test report, they might be able to fix it themselves.
Right.
Okay, so what happened after that? There were some formal charges leveled against you guys, right?
Yeah, the sheriff came back and said that basically arrest him. I think the original arrest was supposed to be for trespassing, and when the sheriff showed back up, that changed to obviously felony burglary. And then from that point, we were arrested and taken to the jail.
So it was 5-year felony for burglary, and then 2-year felony for possession of burglary tools. And those were the formal charges that we arrested on.
Yep.
Mm. So did either of you spend any time in jail, or how'd that work?
Yeah, we were there for about 24 hours, I guess. A little.
Yeah, close to 20 hours or so is how I counted.
Somewhere around there,
Yep.
And I think I read they set your bail at $100,000. Was that each or together, like total?
That was total. So I think initially in Iowa, I think it's something around $5,000 for burglary and a $2,000 surcharge for possession of burglary tools.
Yeah.
Then we're booked. We're sitting in jail overnight, waiting for the morning, and then at that point we kind of do the perp walk across the street back to the courthouse and started speaking with the judge. And at that point, sheriff was there, the county prosecutor was there as well. And the county prosecutor made his case to the judge that we were a flight risk, and that they didn't believe the situation, and that the bail needed to be upgraded to $50,000 apiece.
Yeah, or times 10.
Yeah, essentially 10 times. Yeah, the original what the charges are supposed to be, 10 times the charge.
So did you have to return to the scene of the crime, as it were, to face these charges, or what?
We did, and they weren't very happy about that. The judge wasn't, at least.
Did you ever get a straight answer from the Dallas County Sheriff about why they chose to push for charging and prosecuting? Was it because they really felt like this was a jurisdictional issue that hadn't been solved, or was it something else?
Yeah, I mean, I'll handle that. So I had a discussion. So first, like Gary said, right? We work with law enforcement all over the country, and FBI and Secret Service, right? We're all on the same team, and so I don't blame Sheriff Leonard when he showed up. I'm not sure who he called and what his contacts are, but I believe him that he probably called, and the contacts that he talked about were unaware of the engagement. And so just because, you got two guys that showed up with a letter and they call some other guy at the state, Sheriff Leonard probably called a judge or, somebody at the top who said, I don't know who these guys are. So, I don't blame the decision at all to kind of do the initial detainment. What bothered me, or I guess where I started getting frustrated is, I guess you think about my view, right? I get a call early in the morning, that morning. Hey, we got two guys that were caught doing pen testing and they're in jail. And my initial reaction is like laughing. It's like, oh, that's stupid. Like, why'd they get caught? All right, this stuff will work out. And then 6 hours later, when we found like it's not being resolved, the customer hasn't, the client hasn't called in. At that point, then I realized this is a real serious issue, and it's not just a misunderstanding that a couple phone calls could make up. And so that's where I think, in our view, between the local law enforcement, the judicial branch down there, and then the fact that we are testing those sorts of things, there's a lot of miscommunication there. But ultimately, how it just escalated, and no one seemed to be able to take leadership, and common sense didn't prevail. That was where I got frustrated. That is clearly at a certain point, everybody believed that they were working, believed that they were not there to steal stuff, and believed that they were, working under the auspices of a contract. At that point, I think it should have been escalated to a business discussion versus, taking out these discussions on these two gentlemen. Right.
Well, so I read, I think it was a Des Moines Register. They said that the incident actually prompted a lot of hand-wringing amongst politicians there in Iowa, but not because how poorly this was all handled by the authorities, but because the lawmakers actually used this and passed pen tests that they actually paid for as an example of how efforts to improve, cyber and physical security of the county's public buildings somehow actually made the public less safe. I just want to quote, if I can, from one of the Iowa lawmakers at a hearing about this not long after the arrest there. He said, and I think this was State Senator Amy Sinclair, she told lawmakers, she said, the hiring of an outside company to break into the courthouses in September created, quote, a significant danger not only to the contractors, but to local law enforcement and to members of the public. First of all, do you agree with any of that, or what's your reaction to that? And maybe tell me a little bit about what was going through your head when you were hearing those, that discussion going on at the policy level.
I'll let you guys answer, and then I can tell you my opinion. But
really, oh wow, this might be politically incorrect, but that's what
it's
you get.
Probably going to be.
Yeah. That's what you get when you have politicians trying to talk about security. That's what it comes down to. They should stick to politics and not security. In my honest opinion, it's the exact opposite. That's exactly why you do the testing, is so you can become more secure. The way it's supposed to work is there's a level of trust between the state in this case and the company that they hire. We're under non-disclosure agreements. We don't say anything. We don't share it with anyone. It's between us and the state. The state then takes those findings and then they make things more secure. If anything, I can't understand why somebody wouldn't want that to happen. Basically, that statement says we're better off if we're not tested and we never find out what our security issues are, which doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think I
read somewhere.
Go ahead, Brian. Go ahead. I would say I think it's good at well intentioned, but it's just people jumping to conclusions that don't really understand the business and what the risks are. Yes, there's risks, and yes, we shouldn't have police cars flying around at 100 miles an hour that could put people in danger just for a test. But that's not how this normally works. Like normally, there's some minimal risk, and you address that with communication and processes. And the benefit you get from these is eye-opening. I mean, we go into multiple cities, states, municipalities, and this drives a lot of funding and priorities. To say, hey, this is a big problem. We're putting citizens' data at risk here, and this is unacceptable. And you just don't get that without, actually seeing the results. I mean, when you see the pictures of, people breaking in and what you've got access to, and you realize that, it doesn't take a lot of sophistication in many cases to do this, it's very eye-opening to say, why are we not addressing this in a higher priority? So historically, and we've been doing this a long time, the benefit has fixed issues. It's got priorities. It's helped reduce the risk for citizen data. And in this case, I think that's another issue that, we did this, previously a couple years ago, and I'm not sure who all is seeing the reports and whether the appropriate action is being taken so they're getting the benefit from the testing that we're doing.
Well, I can imagine if I were in your shoes in the pen testing business, I'd be a little spooked by this whole thing. Can you talk a little bit about the reaction that you've seen and heard from other people in your line of work as a result of this?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. So once I talked to Gary the very first night when we bailed him out, which again, there's all these side stories. Like, we've never, I was talking to my CFOs, like we've never bought bail for any, like we didn't even know what the process is to do that. We throw it on a credit card. Like, how does it work? Are we underwriting things? So I think initially I told Gary, I said, hey, my number one priority is to get the charges dropped. And so, I don't care about Coalfire. I don't care about the engagement. Like the number one thing is get the charges dropped because that has long-term repercussions. And so we determined the best interest to do that. And based on a bunch of legal advices, we just kept our mouths shut. And for those first 30 days, we were just getting slammed. People were saying, Coalfire, why are you guys letting your guys rot in jail? Like, how come you're not doing this? This is why you got to have a better scope. This is why you got to do this. And it was interesting to see a lot of the ignorance of people making assumptions about the mistakes that we had made without actually having any knowledge. And I had to do kind of an all hands and talk to the employees saying, look, I know we're getting bashed out there in the media, but the priority is to get the charges dropped, and I'm asking everyone to stay quiet on social media. So that was number one. And that was their best course of action. We thought everything would get resolved in about 30 days. Then once we found out that they were moving forward with the charges, then things changed. And that was when I made a decision to say, we're going to go and we're going to start share the story, because it's not about them. It's about the community. And once we did that, then we saw, basically a huge shift in the pen test community. I mean, people created, hashtags like Stand with Coalfire. I've got lots of, fellow competitors that we compete out there saying, hey, I'm watching this. What can we do to help? How can we say anything? So it was very interesting to watch the entire community kind of rally together once they understood, the facts and more of this information, to say, hey, like, it happened to you guys, but if it happened to you guys, it can happen to any of us, and let's figure out how we can work together.
And I would like to piggyback on that, at least from our point of view. There were still a couple of, I don't want to say individuals, not even really companies, that were still throwing some shade, at least towards Coalfire and Tom. And there wasn't one decision made in this entire process that Tom didn't bring us in and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking about doing. I want to do this. What do you guys think? Like, nothing that came out of Coalfire didn't go through us first. And there was never any decision that was ever made that was not in what we all believed collectively was in our, Justin and I's, best interest as far as getting our charges dropped. And there was definitely some things said that were contrary to that, but it was false. That's something that I think is super important, because there was definitely some things said that kind of upset me, people saying things that they shouldn't have, or that weren't really based in anything. It was just, again, it was assumptions. And a lot of those things were, well, I don't like to make assumptions, but here I am going to go make an assumption. Here's my assumption, right? Yeah. And that's really what it came down to. I couldn't be happier with the way that Tom handled everything.
Right.
Great. Well, what, if anything, has Coalfire taken away from this incident? I mean, has it changed anything going forward about how you all conduct pen tests going forward? And what advice would you give other pen testers to help minimize the chances of something like this happening again?
Yeah, I'll give a couple things for folks to think about. So one, realize, I think we need some sort of kind of cybersecurity Good Samaritan law or equivalent, right? If you see someone that you think is choking or dying, you give them CPR, and something happens to them, you're protected around that. We're doing similar work on the cyber side, and when customers give us IP addresses or physical buildings and they say you're authorized to do this, and we execute according to that, we have no protection. So think about all the pen testers out there. You may pen test an IP address that someone gives you the wrong one, and you take down a network. You've got no protection today, right now. So I think people should be aware of the risk of what we're doing in cybersecurity is probably a lot higher than many may have thought of from a legal perspective, because we're kind of in this gray area. Two, there are some things that can't be undone. I mean, there's the mugshots that are out there for forever, but even as we get the charges dropped, we can't get these are permanently going to be in the federal database, right? This is a permanent thing that will reside with them, and there's no legal way that we're aware of to get these charges removed from the federal database. Like, we can get them removed from the state level and the county level, but ultimately they're going to be there. So these guys go and need another job 20 years from now or 5 years from now, they look at there and there's going to be charges that exist for forever. And there's nothing we can do about it. And then three, I would say, when we look at the contracts and we look at who's authorized to do what, typically if a CISO says, hey, test these IP addresses or go to these systems, we would say, okay, that's enough. We're questioning, and from a legal perspective saying, at what point does that need to have legal counsel review or something else like that? Because even in this case here, I don't think there's really any bad people, right? I think everyone was trying to do the right things, from from law enforcement, the sheriff, the judges, the county. They all had the right intentions, but they didn't necessarily have all the right information, and possibly people made decisions at levels that they weren't really authorized to do. Normally that's not our call, but I think people need to be thinking about that, is what's that protection? And then finally, I would say, I'm glad, I've known Gary for, over 5 years here, Justin, I've known for a little bit here, but having that relationship was unique here because initially I told them, like, look, trust in us, we'll take care of you. So I don't think most firms would, immediately pay for bail, cover all expenses, like cover all the legal costs, say, look, our job is to get these things dropped. So for organizations, particularly in larger organizations or very small organizations, right, where they can't write a $250,000 check to try to figure out how to deal with things, people should realize there's a lot of risk with their specific employer, and to question that if these sorts of things happened, would the company move that way? Would they take the same stance, and would they be as proactive? And if not, then raise those internally so that there is a process.
Well, it raises an interesting question about, state and local engagements, doesn't it? I mean, if you get hired by the state, what obligation, if any, do you have to coordinate or at least contact the local officials and say what you're doing? So, you know what I mean? Like, so, because I can see, a local police in that situation saying, well, hey, we're just doing our job. We didn't know about some contract with the state. Have your operating procedures or your processes going forward changed at all in that respect, do you think?
Yeah, I think we're still going through. So I think there's really two parts, which is one, I would say we're lucky in some respect in the fact that these two guys are very seasoned. So they kind of knew what the best practices were. We looked at our training and saying, how do we ensure that people know who to reach out to? And as we have lessons learned from this, how do we go and push that out to hundreds and hundreds of people? But really it's around, it's unique. IT has, this world has gone from being an IT issue, right? Historically, when I used to deal with this, I'd worked with system administrators and IT folks, to kind of being a CISO, CIO level issue, to really being a board level or top line issue. But the contracts and the processes we have are still very, maybe technical. And we really need to kind of look at what the best practices are from a legal perspective. So I think to your question, right? Like these are things where I think, as a cybersecurity company, we do the engagement, but we've now got to, I think, continue to step back and say, hey, well, there's state, there's local, there's federal, who needs to notify what? And even if the client decides not to do that, do we walk away from that and say, no, you are required to notify the FBI and the Secret Service. You're required to have counsel legally tell us that the buildings you're telling us are authorized, right? There's a lot of things that are being done right now, and there's no standard out there in the industry. So that's the biggest challenge right now, is we've got a lot of best practices like OWASP and NIST and other standards out there. But when it comes to these sorts of issues and red teaming, the legal challenges and the contractual structure, there's really nothing out there.
Maybe there should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Tom, you made a point, I think, a few minutes ago that maybe it's a little more precarious to be in this profession than it was earlier. I don't know if that's exactly what you said, but I wanted to draw you out on that, because in some ways the work that penetration testers do is similar to discoveries made by independent security researchers, people who find bugs in software and hardware and then run up against the hard problem of how do I communicate this to the breached company or the vulnerable company, the company that made this software that's full of holes. Are there parallels there? And do you think it's any safer for researchers to avoid prosecution these days for finding bugs than it was maybe just a few years ago? Or, I'd be curious your thoughts on the progression there.
So to your question of like, have things changed? I think they definitely have, right? I think that people need to think about that if you're in information security, you're in some spectrum of cyber warfare today, whether you realize it or not. And as part of that, the things that you're maybe doing may be considered cyber attacks or may have higher risks. And increasingly that burden is falling to kind of commercial, state, local government. And I think, most state, local government, and commercial worlds are unprepared. I mean, you see this from the malware attacks. You see this from the ransomware that's going out. Even all the PCI breaches that we continue to see, right? There's a lot of that money is used for criminal activity or used for things that are not for the good of society. So bottom line, I think that we've got an obligation as cybersecurity professionals to make the world a little bit safer. but we have to realize that it is becoming increasingly dangerous every day in what we do. And whether you're sitting at home in your PJs, on your laptop, the stuff you're doing may be considered warfare, may be considered bringing down networks, and may actually put you at risk. And need to think about how committed we are to improving security, but two, how do we work as an industry to help protect all of us that are out there, that are the good guys, that are trying to stop the bad guys out there.
Right. So the stakes are higher. Might be a little. There might be more avenues for people to disclose these vulnerabilities, but the stakes are a lot higher because we're way more reliant on this stuff than ever before. Yeah.
Absolutely, and things are much more interconnected that in ways we may not understand, right? And if you accidentally take down a system or accidentally disclose a vulnerability, and you might have let's say there's a 0 day and you think you disclosed it, but then maybe that's hard coded into some things that can't get fixed, and now you've put a bunch of hospitals at risk. Are you liable? So whether you're in research or anything else, we really got to think about what's the appropriate way to disclose. But more than that, how do we protect people that believe they're doing the right thing? And if they have questions on what they're doing, who do they go to? Because most cybersecurity people are not going to call a bunch of lawyers and say, I'm thinking about doing it this way, right? We are letting the cybersecurity community down in that respect. This doesn't deter us from continuing to do this work, right? And just because there were some challenges in this engagement doesn't mean that we're not going to do it. In fact, I think it highlights that there's more of a need for people to do this sort of work. So I hope there's a lot of positive lessons learned out this. And, I'd continue to support, this is beyond Coalfire now. This is about the information security community. And so I'm happy to, contribute resources, do what we can to go and help make progress in the information, security community. We just don't know what that next step is. So if people have suggestions, and whether that's creating committees or working, to pass a law, or just education and training so that we can share our stories so that others don't go through the same challenges, we're happy to do that. So our efforts are on looking forward into making things better.
And I guess I'd like to add, I don't know if we've really kind of hit that point yet or not. This was very abnormal. This was not standard for what we do. We've dealt with, like we were saying, we've dealt with multiple law enforcement agencies, and it's never even got to the point where we've been held. Yeah. Or even taken in or even handcuffed, to be honest with you. It typically ends up with us going out and talking to law enforcement, them checking our credentials, them making a call. Sometimes they don't even make the call. They check our ID. They check that we're working for a cybersecurity company. We explain the situation. And a lot of that has to do with, at least in this instance, is private property versus public property. But this is absolutely a one-off from anything that we've ever done. And I've been here almost 6 years now, and I've never seen anything like this. So this was definitely something that doesn't happen normally, but we also don't want it to happen again.
Yeah. I mean, it's more than one. We've done over 1,000 of these, so it's less than 1 in 1,000, right? Chance that we've seen this. But I think maybe, Brian, your earlier point, right, is the world is a little bit more aware about cybersecurity risks. And in the past, having people showing a letter, and the fact that people are doing more diligence, I think is a good thing. Mm-hmm. But the fact that common sense doesn't prevail because of communication, legal jurisdiction, that's a unique challenge. And one other nuance that maybe people aren't aware of, right? There were never any there was never any charges filed against the company. Right? The charges were against those two as individuals. So even though they were working for us and they were doing the engagement, that was also unique in the fact that they didn't have to notify us, they didn't run us stuff down. Like, these two were literally on their own as burglars, considered working outside of the contract, and we had no legal obligation or anything to do anything for them because they were treated that way. And I thought that was a unique and it's a disservice. I mean, they're obviously working for us, and I thought that was another unique thing from the legal domain, is that they weren't charged as employees.
Yeah, and this could have turned out very, very poorly for somebody else at a different company. Very poorly. We were to the point where the customer cut off all communication with us, and we were left in jail with nothing. They basically threw their hands up and said, we don't know these people. We don't know who they are. And whether or not that's what they really said, I don't know. I'm talking from my point of view from sitting inside a jail cell. But if Coalfire decided at that point to say, hey, you know what? These charges are on you guys. We're not being charged with anything. This is you. We'd probably still be there.
Yep.
Yeah, and in fact, actually, we did get some of that initial. That was actually some legal advice we got in the very beginning. We said, hey, we said we're going to bail out, and some of the initial legal advice was don't get involved into this. Once you start paying bail for them, like you're on the hook. And so all I had to do was listen to that, and I guess you guys maybe still be in jail now.
Please tell them what you said. I think it's important. I loved it.
What's that?
It was the best thing that you said this whole entire thing.
Revive what I said.
Tom said something to the effect of, you need to find me legal counsel that tells me to bail you out. And then he sent all the VPs scrambling to go find that person.
I think that's where I say common sense doesn't prevail, right? There's a lot of people that do stuff, and I said, really, that doesn't seem to make sense to me. Let's go and see if that's the only opinion out there that matters. And I think that's, as leaders in this space, if you just listen to kind of certain people, you make bad decisions. So I think the leadership part of this, of making sure we got leaders that are taking care of people and are doing the right things, even if they're just getting beat up in the media. I was telling my wife, I felt like I was a politician for like 30 days, just, getting slammed in the media and everybody asking all my friends about what's going on. And I can't talk about it. But ultimately, we kind of have this motto of assume good intent and assume that people are doing the right thing. And I think that's what we need to continue to do here. Yeah.
Well, like it or not, cybersecurity is a political issue in so many ways these days. Listen, Tom, Gary, Justin, thank you once again for taking the time to talk with me. Really interesting stuff, and I wish you the best of luck going forward. I hope none of this happens again for you all. For anybody else.
I was going to say, I hope we don't talk again, but, in the world we're in, the world you're in, there's a lot more overlaps, and unfortunately, I think as a community, we're losing the fight here in cybersecurity, and we got to find a way to turn it around.
I was just going to add that I just got an email during the interview that Gary and Justin, the charges have officially been dropped.
Oh, thank you. I've been sweating that the last 24 hours. Thanks, Patrick. Man. Whew.